Hi, this is Jonathan Rosenhead, Jewish psychotherapist. This week's Torah and Psychology post, Parshas Re'eh, is titled "The Psychology of Grief and Mourning in Judaism." So first we need to understand what is grief, and this is the challenge in a sense, because there's a difficulty in defining grief, in the sense that it's been used in the academic literature in different ways. There isn't really a precise or consistent meaning to grief. And sometimes grief is referred to as being almost an emotional experience which has its own individual specific characteristics. In other ways, in other places, grief is referred to as almost like a collection of a complex collection of different emotions together, which is expressed in what we refer to as grief. So certainly there's an ambiguity about grief, and perhaps also the ambiguity or the difficulty in defining grief in a certain way is because inherently grief is a personal and subjective experience. Each person experiences grief in a different way, and it's a process that develops and manifests in a different way according to each person, in accordance to the specific situation and the characteristics of the person. So perhaps this means that it leads to a difficulty in coming up and being able to reach a definitive definition of grief. But there is a general accepted understanding, a general impression that grief is a response, an emotional response. It's a certain behavioral pattern in response to the loss of somebody, and then you enter into a process of grief with mourning and bereavement for this loss. And perhaps basically what we see from the literature is that the difficulty of understanding grief is more in a sense of a conceptualization of this pattern, of this behavior. But we can understand it, and the accepted understanding of grief is this response of a loss and mourning. And in this week's parsha, there's a pasuk that says that in response to the loss of a person, when we are mourning the death of somebody, we cannot cut ourselves. A person cannot cut themselves or make a bold spot in response, in grief to the loss of this person. And what we see here is the Torah is giving a specific a guideline in the sense of how we can respond to grief. What is an acceptable response and expression of grief? And what we see in halacha is that there's a certain specific guidelines in terms of the process of mourning in halacha in Judaism. That there's kriya, there's kaddish, there's shiva, there's the transition from a period of being an oinen to being an avel. There's the shiva, as we said, there's the first month, there's the whole of the first year, and gradually a person goes through a process of responding and being able to process and in a sense recover or move on from the loss and move through this process of grief. And within the academic, in the psychological literature, there's many different theories have been proposed in order to map out and to model this gradual process in terms of trying to understand the grief process of each individual person, but try to understand the common characteristics or dynamics of grief that can be modeled into a psychological explanation or definition. But what we see from what the Torah is saying is that the process of the halacha of shiva, the process of avelos, is giving us an acceptable and also an adaptive way of responding to the grief, rather than what the pasuk says in terms of cutting or making it as bold spots, which are negative or maladaptive responses to grief. And it's interesting, within the literature and within the psychology literature, it actually looks at the process or the understanding in Judaism in the halacha of avelos, and try to understand the psychological benefits of avelos in Judaism. And it shows and it says that what is key to the avelos process is that there's a great wisdom in the sense that it gives a person this psychological space in order to respond in a gradual way, and also it gives the person the ability to confront their emotions, to consider their emotions, and find a space to be able to find meaning within this grief, meaning within this suffering and loss. And this meaning making is a key ingredient, a component to be able to move on, and as the literature says, to make the decision to move on in one's life and to continue living rather than being stuck within the grief for the person that you've lost. And in particular, we can look at what the Torah says in terms of this, in a sense, aggressive or violent response, this expression of grief, which is coming out of a place out of anger or aggression or frustration, of cutting yourself and making a bold spot, which is a very aggressive and violent act. And within the literature itself, which looks at the idea of Kriya or Kaddish and Shiva, within these symbolic acts of Shiva, it says that perhaps from a psychoanalytical approach, the benefit of these acts of Shiva is to take this perhaps natural response, or perhaps a response that is likely to happen of anger and aggression and frustration and these negative emotions that a person experiences in response to loss and grief, and finds a conduit and an adaptive conduit to express this. So rather than cutting or making bold spots, it says, no, you can do Kriya, and there's Shiva, and there's Kaddish, and these provide a symbolic action which provides us with meaning, and in a sense is able to transfer these negative emotions, these aggressive actions in order to express the grief, and it now is expressed in an adaptive and in a functional way that gives meaning to the loss and helps us to find peace and solace within this grief process to move on in our life. Have a great Shabbos and keep well.